Good evening, folks, and welcome back. Such a pleasure to be here. Such a pleasure to see so many familiar faces. I think, as I've said before, we're very lucky here to have a very special community of enthusiastic musicians, both neophytes as well as veterans. Tonight, I want to start off by wishing a very happy birthday to the most important person in my life, the mother of Aria, to my daughter, and my wife, Amy. And I think that given the spirit of the program tonight, it's only appropriate to start the evening with an augmented dominant chord. Happy birthday, Amy. I love you for being here, and I'm sorry that it seems to be that every time your birthday comes around, I've always got a lecture, so thank you for being here. The baby is here, yeah. She's a scholar in training, you know. She's very enthusiastic about all sorts of music. Alexa, play Shostakovich. Is that really appropriate for a 2-month-old? Well, I think maybe it would be appropriate to start tonight's program by talking a little bit about the rendition of Happy Birthday that I just played. Because one of the most nebulous aspects of jazz, I think, is exactly what makes music sound jazzy. It would be very easy to listen to something and say, oh yes, that sounds very jazzy. But what does that mean? To understand that, we have to get into the nuts and bolts of a little bit of music theory. Now, some of us in this room love music theory, right? Perhaps you took a class on a college campus, or maybe you learned about this very esoteric concept known as the circle of fifths. One of the myths is that jazz musicians, they don't read music, or they somehow just they're always improvising, and so therefore it's not really necessary to understand music theory. I would argue that the antithesis of that statement is true. Jazz musicians tend to have very polished chops when it comes not only to the virtuosity they display on their respective instruments, but also when it comes to the cerebral understanding of what's happening in the music. Take, for example, this short, humble rendition of Happy Birthday. I could have begun it on a simple, what we call dominant triad. Right? And those would be simple chords comprised of exactly 3 notes. In music theory, a chord is defined as 3 notes or more sounded simultaneously. If 3 notes is the minimum, then it stands to reason that a triad, which has exactly 3 notes, is the simplest kind of chord. Now, I could ask a rhetorical question here. Do you think we're going to get a lot of triads in jazz? And the answer is no. So, if you were asked what makes music sound jazzy, you might say, well, to some degree, it is the absence of simple triads in the harmony. Rather than have a simple 3-note chord, jazz musician might play instead a 4-note chord with an altered structure to give it a more dissonant, and you might say, slightly, to use a term that musicians use, a slightly crunchier sound, like a breakfast cereal. So instead of playing this, I might play this. Instead of playing, I might play this. Now, if you're an astute listener, and this is something we do on the college campus, we torment music majors with something called ear training. And ask anyone who's taken ear training, it can either be your favorite subject or it can be medieval torture. It depends on how your ears are, and that's not something that you can sort of cram. It's not like memorizing dates for a history exam or formulas and algorithms for a mathematics exam. Hearing is a much more abstract phenomenon, and it's difficult to put your finger on exactly why one person can hear something very clearly and why another person might struggle, even if those two people started studying at the same time, played the same instrument, grew up in the same house, etc. Now, if you had really sensitive ears, you might hear that this chord has an augmented triad with a dominant seventh, which then moves to a tonic major 7 with a 6-5 paggiatura. A secondary dominant of the dominant with a flat 9 to the dominant, but with an added 13th. So you're getting a sense, I think, even in the first 2 bars of this jazzy version of Happy Birthday, how complex jazz harmony is. And in fact, many a gifted, facile, classical musician might really struggle with this. You'd have to have a music theory professor who was particularly enthusiastic about jazz harmony. Else, you might never learn it. It might be something that is omitted from the curriculum. In fact, in my experience as an undergraduate at Brandeis University, it was completely omitted. Much like the music of Sergei Rachmaninoff and many other great composers, Maurice Ravel, Samuel Barber, I never even heard about it. Now, as a footnote to this story, I started playing jazz at a rather young age. In fact, I was just finishing up junior high school when I began playing. And of all the idioms within jazz that I first was drawn to, it was bebop, which is arguably one of the most complex styles of jazz. In fact, we're going to talk quite a bit about bebop today. So perhaps that tells you a little bit about my own proclivities as a listener and as a performer. I always gravitated towards intricate styles of music. Perhaps it explains why I wrote my dissertation on the music of J.S. Bach. When it comes to complexity, intricacy, embellishment, ornamentation, simultaneity, polyphonic, contrapuntal textures, Bach is at the apogee of music history when it comes to all those things. And it's been said that Bach's music is the most complex music to have been written really until the 20th century. And to some degree, I think that is true. You could compare Bach to Wagner or Bruckner or any of the other late romantics, and you would find their music to be complex as well, but for different reasons. So when we say that music is complex, it could mean any number of things. There are many ingredients that make different types of music complex. For Wagner, the music is complex on account of the harmony. I've talked to you about augmented 7th chords. I've talked to you about secondary dominant 7 flat 9 chords. When it comes to the opening chord of Wagner's Tristan und Isolde, 1865, there is no name for the chord. We simply call it the Tristan chord. And it's a chord that, according to various musicologists, scholars, historians, is supposed to reflect the yearning of the Kantian noumenal mind towards a Schopenhauerian emptiness and intangibility. Really, it's about sex. Wagner can be distilled down usually to sex or some sort of pro-German nationalism, right? It's one or the other. Tonight I'd like to talk to you about a radical shift in jazz history that took place between the 1930s and into the 1940s and beyond. In our last lecture, we talked about Dixieland and ragtime before that, and we set out to establish a goal at the beginning of the program, and I'd like to do the same thing tonight. Last week, we set out to understand how to orally distinguish between different types of jazz. And we began with ragtime, and we said that ragtime, technically speaking, Well, it has certain jazzy elements, that is to say, a heavily syncopated rhythm, which became a hallmark of the jazz style, a certain looseness in the melody, certain chord structures which are based on European classical harmony, but perhaps go one step beyond in terms of their complexity. But ragtime is not jazz. It's like a G flat and a B. Two tones. It's a little bit wider than a major third, though. I was going to have to do some research into that. Why is ragtime technically not jazz? And we said the answer is because it lacks improvisation. And improvisation is one of the pillars of jazz. In order for a musical style to qualify as jazz, it should have some sort of improvised element. We also said that ragtime was a genre that exists predominantly for the piano solo, although not exclusively. And in fact, we talked about Scott Joplin, and I mentioned ever so briefly that at the end of his career, Joplin was, in fact, working on larger scale idioms, including an opera, Tremonisha. Joplin died in 1917. We then talked about Dixieland, and we said that jazz in the 19-teens and 1920s really starts to coalesce into a recognizable form in New Orleans. Then it makes its way over to Chicago and New York. We have a sort of triangle of innovation. And we talked about some of the figures associated with this early style of jazz, which is sometimes called hot jazz, traditional jazz, or my preferred term, which is Dixieland. It has a more poetic flavor. I think some would agree. We talked about some of the distinguishing factors, how we can listen to Dixieland and know that it really is music from, say, the 1920s. And one of the things we talked about was simultaneous improvisation, or what's sometimes called collective improvisation. And we listened to examples by Louis Armstrong's group, the Hot Seven, a recording from Chicago in the late 1920s, where you could hear an almost chaotic, sometimes cacophonous combination of soloists playing at the same time. A trombone, a trumpet, a clarinet, all soloing independently, simultaneously. That's something that they would do away with by the 1930s. Tonight we're going to learn about swing music, bebop, and we're going to end the program talking about West Coast jazz, sometimes called cool jazz, sometimes described as being two separate phenomena, but I think it's fair to say that they have enough in common that we can consider them one entity. How did jazz change in the swing era? Well, a couple of important changes in the music, and we're going to take a look at something by Duke Ellington in just a moment. We talked about the chaos that happens when you have simultaneous soloists. In the swing era, sometimes called the big band era, because the ensembles grew from, say, 5 or 7 to a much larger number, 15, 18, 20, perhaps even more than 20, if you were very successful and you were making good money, as the big band leaders were, the Benny Goodmans, the Glenn Millers were making enough money. Glenn Miller in the early 1940s was making about $15,000 a week. In $1940, you might say he was a big macher. That's big money that he was making. And he gave it up, by the way, to go overseas to boost morale and play for the army. And of course, in 1944, leaving England, headed to Paris, his plane disappeared. Historians mostly agree that it was probably a carburetor failure that caused the plane to crash into the English Channel. There is, by the way, a new initiative that was just codified last month. I forget the name of the group, but it's an acronym that stands for such and such group for the historical discovery of lost aircraft. Something like that. And they have put on the top of their agenda the recovery of Glenn Miller's aircraft, which is believed to be at the bottom of the English Channel. So, fascinating historical footnote to add to our program tonight, because this is really a 2019 thing as it unfolds. If you were making big money, you could afford to hire 20, 22 musicians. So the big band era really was an era of large ensembles. And they tend to eschew the word band, combo, or even ensemble. A word we encounter quite a bit in this era is orchestra, a jazz orchestra. What are some of the defining traits or attributes of this music? Well, it becomes highly organized, more so than ever before. Collective improvisation is mostly a thing of the past at this point, although it will be resurrected in the future, most notably by Charles Mingus, who was not only an advocate for collective improvisation, but also has, I think, one of the most clever jazz record titles of all time, Mingus Among Us. Mingus was described by Miles Davis as a crazy, psychotic, beautiful genius. He was a large man, 6'4", as wide as a door. He played the upright bass. He was a very innovative composer. And if you'll recall last week, we opened with an anecdote of Mingus throwing a highball glass at an especially garrulous, rowdy patron and screaming, "Isaac Stern doesn't have to put up with this expletive." We'll talk about Mingus, by the way, next week when we discuss modal jazz and jazz of the post-1959 world. When we get to John Coltrane, Miles Davis, Mingus, and perhaps if we don't get to him tonight, Dave Brubeck. We're going to talk about a few people who are associated with Connecticut, Brubeck being one, the baritone saxophone player, Gerry Mulligan being another. Actually, Gerry Mulligan died in Darien. Doesn't sound particularly uplifting to say that. I would say he was born here, but he wasn't. He was born in Queens, and having grown up in Queens, I could say I'd much rather be in Darien than anywhere in the borough of Queens. Anywhere. Then again, I'd rather be at the Darien Library, Pat, than most places. This is, as I've told Pat many times, it's a very, very special atmosphere here. So things are organized to a tremendous degree. And what that means is that they're notated, they're written out. Remember we talked about jazz orchestras? We're going to have sections just as you would have in a symphonic orchestra. Except those sections are going to be comprised of the following. A rhythm section, which would involve typically piano, bass, drums. You're also going to have a horn section. The word horn, as it's used in jazz, can be ambiguous and occasionally misleading. It does not refer to French horns. French horn, by the way, is how that terminology is phasing out now in the scholarship. Now we tend to say horn and just leave it at that. But horn in this case usually refers to saxophone. So you're going to have a group of saxophone players, typically alto and tenor. There are other saxophones, soprano, even sopranino, baritone. Those are less likely to be encountered, especially in this period. The clarinet, which had been a very popular instrument in the 1920s and into the 1930s, remains somewhat popular, but really that's the end of the clarinet, is in the 30s and into the 40s. By the time we get to the 40s, the clarinet has been supplanted by the saxophone, almost to the point where you'd have to go out of your way to hear a clarinetist, at least someone who is playing in a contemporary style on the clarinet. And these sections are going to have written out parts. You're going to have a brass section comprised of trumpets, trombones, and probably that's it. You're not going to encounter flugelhorns, although you might. If you're listening to Miles Davis's Birth of the Cool, you're going to have flugelhorn, you're going to have baritone saxophone, softer, more blunted timbres or sound colors, or as the Germans say, Klangfarbe. Everything sounds so smooth in German. Speaking of smooth, Klangfarbe versus the French timbre. I prefer Klangfarbe. At any rate, unfortunately, we're not going to get to talk about too much German tonight, although you will recall that we ended last week's program talking about how swing had become an international phenomenon so popular that the Nazis went out of their way to try to ban it. Remember, they said it was entartete Musik, degenerate music linked to two groups of Untermenschen or subhumans, blacks and Jews, and therefore to be shunned, verboten, forbidden to listen to. But swing music raised jazz to higher levels than ever before. Unprecedented popularity. For the first time, an original American musical idiom was arguably one of the most popular styles, at least in the Western world. What does this music look like? Don't worry, we're getting there, sweetheart. I know you. She wants to hear. Here's a ballad by Duke Ellington. I'm going to play it on the piano. It will be difficult for us to get a sense of what this sounds like for a full orchestra. But what I'd like to demonstrate here is what this music looks like when it's notated in shorthand. Jazz musicians have a very specific kind of shorthand, sometimes called a lead sheet. What it does is it presents you with a melody and then this esoteric, rather arcane symbol. For example, it says, you see where it says G maj 7? It's saying G major 7 chord to an E minor 7 chord to an A 7 chord. Let's hear a little bit of what that sounds like. I think maybe if we could just get the lights right up front, it would make it a little bit easier to see. So a nice slow ballad, this one by Duke Ellington, one of the great composers, arrangers, and band leaders and pianists of that period. And we repeat. And that's what we call the tune, or as jazz musicians would sometimes say, the head. The sheet music, by the way, comes from a collection known as the real book, or sometimes called the fake book. The idea being that if you had this shorthand notation, you could play the music reasonably well, and therefore, even if you didn't really know it, you could fake it. Ergo, the fake book. This particular document is the real book, volume 1. It's about 560 pages. What it tells us is that there are an awful lot of jazz standards in the canon. Well, what do you do after you play the head? A jazz musician is going to improvise, right? And in fact, as we said last week, in just about every era of jazz history, improvisation plays a cornerstone role in shaping the music and the identity of the soloists, right? You're going to be able to hear something and say, wow, that sounds like John Coltrane, or that sounds like Charlie Parker, or maybe you'd even hear it and you say, that sounds like Pharoah Sanders, or Albert Ayler, or any number of other musicians, the last two being certainly more obscure figures than the former two. How do you solo in jazz? This is something that is not immediately obvious, and again, to go back to something I said earlier, it really necessitates having a fundamentally thorough understanding of music theory. So if we start with the G major 7 chord, you might play any number of tones that belong within the ambitus of G major 7. Now to A7. Now, you could play any note from G major 7 to start, and you've got exactly 4 beats to play there. And then you've got to move, and you've got to get to the next chord, and then to the next chord, and the next chord. And sometimes the harmonic rhythm, that is to say the pace at which the chords change, is going to be varied. It's not going to necessarily always be the same. And every time the chord changes, ostensibly the jazz musician is going to have to think of the new tones that belong to that particular chord, ambitus. So for the first 4 beats, I could play a G or a B or a D or an F sharp, but maybe I want to be cheeky, and I want to play a tone that's not in the chord. Maybe I want to play an E natural, give it a 13th above the root. Maybe I want to double that F sharp and really bring out the major 7th, that dissonance against the root. Maybe I want to play an A and give it a sound of a 9th. You see, so there's an awful lot to consider. And a jazz musician who's improvising here is going to have to really understand the connection between these chords. Now here's the good news. For those of you aspiring improvisers, most jazz standards are going to have chords that have a fundamentally close relationship to one another. That is to say, G major 7 to E minor, that's a very close relationship. We have this symbol we use when we talk about chords called the circle of fifths. Perhaps some of you learned it. Maybe you were forced to study it until you memorized it and could name every key signature by rote. But chords, you could think of them as being numbers on a clock. And so it's unlikely to jump from 1 o'clock to 7 o'clock or something like that. You're not going to go all the way across. You're going to go from one related chord to another. And if you were to use a language analogy, think of it like going from Spanish at 12 o'clock to Italian at 1 o'clock. This is going to be the case until we get to the bebop era. And then all of a sudden, the chords are going to have a much looser connection. So much so that by the time we get to John Coltrane's Giant Steps in 1959, which is a very bebop-influenced tune, you're going to be hearing chords which have about as much of a relationship as Italian does to Javanese or Japanese or Swahili or something that has really nothing fundamentally phonetically in common, grammatically, etc., to extend the language analogy. We're going to see some examples of that. I want to wrap up the swing era discussion by talking about Glenn Miller, whom we alluded to earlier. Miller was one of the most successful band leaders of the big band era. You're going to see a video here, which is actually a clip from a movie from the early 1940s. So you'll see sort of a staged, curated version of what this might have looked like, but it's not dissimilar from how it might have looked in real life. You're going to see people dancing. Swing music, as the title suggests, was very much a genre that was intertwined with physical motion, dancing, and therefore it was a youth movement. It was something that was condemned by some, certainly ruffled feathers of others, typically in the older generation, because, of course, when people are dancing and sweating and cavorting and socializing, they're touching, there's immodesty, and of course, if you were a concerned parent back then, you would be concerned that it would lead to some sort of promiscuous sexual behavior, and that was, of course, undesirable if you were in the older generation. If you were in the younger generation of the swing movement, this was the apex of entertainment, right? You got to listen to great music played by great musicians, and you got to dance, and there were prescribed dances, some of which are well known and even done today. There are people who still practice swing dancing. There are swing dance clubs on college campuses. So the style of swing dancing will be familiar, I think, to many visually. Remember, we said that swing music is very organized. There's no collective improvisation, and even when an instrumentalist is improvising, typically it's backed up by a section that are going to be doing what's called playing hits. That is to say, specifically synchronized, coordinated, sort of backing accents, which are fitted to propel the music along its chord trajectory or chord changes. So you'll see that in the video here. Glenn Miller himself unusually was a trombonist. Most of the historically really prominent figures in the jazz world were trumpeters or perhaps saxophone players. The saxophone, I think, is kind of a symbol of jazz in many ways. Or maybe drummers or pianists. And there were some great trombonists as well. Glenn Miller certainly comes to mind. So here is one of the most well-known tunes from that period. Here's In the Mood. And again, you'll see the different sections. You can see the way they're arrayed here. Very neatly organized, even from a spatial configuration perspective. Very different from what we saw last week, where the musicians seemed to sort of just be hanging around in a rather random, arbitrary formation. Here, you'll notice they're wearing coordinated outfits. There was a real sort of polish to this style, and that reached a kind of apex of its own in 1938 when Benny Goodman brought his swing orchestra into Carnegie Hall. Carnegie Hall was opened, I think, in 1891 or something, and had been hallowed ground, the home of Beethoven and Brahms and Haydn and Mahler, and all of a sudden, here it was in 1938, playing host to Benny Goodman and his jazz orchestra. Can't be overstated the sort of social impact of this event. It's a very famous moment in jazz history, and what it symbolically represented was the cultural elevation of jazz to a level of art music rather than it being a sort of popular movement. So here is a great example. So we have this elaborate head that takes up the first minute of this 3-minute clip. Music in that period would have been limited to about 3 minutes in a recording, and that was due to the technological limitations of the studio at that point. It was what you could fit on one side of a 78 RPM record. So obviously in a 3-minute tune, if we're going to start with a minute of essentially what is the melody or the head, then you could tell that a lot of what's going to be played is already sort of organized and programmed in advance. Now we get a tenor saxophone solo. You can tell it's a tenor saxophone because of the curve at the top of the horn. And you'll hear that as the tenor saxophone player is soloing, the orchestra is going to be playing those hits that we talked about, those really tightly synchronized, coordinated accents, really is what they are, that are going to propel the soloist forward. I think at one point I knew what movie this was from. Does anybody know? A 1941 film. I'm terrible with black and white films. I have always had an aversion to them. I can't explain it. Peculiar idiosyncrasy of mine. However, it should be noted that this is not an actual live performance, but a staged performance that was part of the film. Nonetheless, as I said earlier, probably not inaccurate in how it depicts the musicians in the orchestra. Notice they're even sort of moving in a synchronized way. It seems almost, dare I say, gimmicky, doesn't it, when the trombonists raise their slides and lower them. But it gives it that tightly coordinated patina, that sort of outside shell which is lacquered and polished, and it presents a very, very sophisticated and refined style of jazz. They've done away with some of the chaotic simultaneity of the previous era, and the swing period is really dominated by a lot of music which is written out in advance, a lot of tightly coordinated music played between different sections of the orchestra, and therefore as listeners, I think we'd feel very confident after tonight, if we weren't already, identifying music either from the Dixieland period and now from the swing period. So we're smarter now than we were a half hour ago. And that's the great thing about being in a library. You get smarter. It's true. So, why did the swing period end? Why did the swing bands die out? Really, if you think about it, most historians say the swing period dates to about 1933 and is really over by the end of the Second World War. Why? What were some of the contributing factors leading to the demise of this very, as we said, very palatable, very accessible, very polished style? Why was it so ephemeral in its popularity? Gesundheit. Let me suggest a few reasons. Number one, World War II. World War II, especially after December 7th, 1941, you've got a lot of able-bodied young men who are no longer at liberty to be playing and traveling and gigging and performing. They're enlisted. They're off in the Pacific Theater. They're off in Europe. And even if you weren't on the front lines, if you were a musician, you might be in a military band, not unlike the one that Glenn Miller directed from 1942 till his death in 1944. And your job would be to provide entertainment in the barracks, on the bases, and to boost morale, to provide a little bit of diversion and entertainment for the soldiers. That's number one. Number two, and this is a peculiar footnote to the story, there was a recording strike in the early 1940s that lasted more than 2 years. And what were they striking about? Why were the studios closed in that period? Well, it was because they had no clue how to handle something which to us today seems like a given, and that is the concept of intellectual property and royalties. Remember that jazz holds the peculiar distinction of being an idiom which is really born into the era of recording technology. Mozart certainly didn't have any kind of recording technology. That's why classical music is so filled with repeats. When you finish a section in a classical sonata, you almost invariably go back and repeat it once more because you want your audience to hear it over and over again. Here, you've got record players, victrolas. You've got people who can listen to music at will, at leisure. And that's a very fascinating thing to consider. But as far as royalties go, this was a new discussion. It had never been brought to the table before. And by the 1940s, as we said, jazz had become so popular that the question of royalties became so hot and so fiercely contested that there was a blanket ban on official recordings for more than 2 years in the early 40s. Number three, cost. Well, we see the size of a swing orchestra. And if you've got 18 people or thereabouts, you've got to pay them. You've got to get them on the road. You've got to get them in the hotels and the restaurants and so on and so forth. So that's a factor to consider. And last but not least, post-World War II, you have the great suburban migration. The birth of the baby boomer generation out, not in Queens, but places like Darien. You've got people being born in Long Island. And if you're away from a cosmopolitan epicenter of artistic creativity, you're not going to be going out and dancing. Also, as many people here can attest to, in the post-World War II era, a lot of people were having babies. And if you're having babies and you're raising, you've got an infant at home, you're not going to be going out to the dance halls. I could tell you, Amy and I, the library is about as exciting as it gets. So those are some reasons that we could say contributed. If someone were to ask you, what happened to the big band era? Why did it last such a short amount of time? Why was its existence so ephemeral? You would say, well, for all the reasons we just discussed. What supplanted swing? Well, it's bebop. Bebop is a funny word. The etymological origins of bebop are a bit difficult to trace, much like jazz, which was originally spelled J-A-S-S, and the first use of it dates to the early part of the second decade of the 20th century. Bebop dates to this period, 1940s, and it seems to be the case that it's just a nonsense phoneme that was invented because the music was so fast, so virtuosic, that you couldn't really sing along with it. So you would just kind of scat along on syllables that resembled B or bop. Can't really sing actual pitches there. Maybe some really good vocalists could. But it would be very difficult to have a tune the same way you'd have with In the Mood. In the Mood, we could hum it, we could whistle it, we could sing it. It wouldn't be a difficult thing to do. If you had two people, you could go back and forth between the melody and the counter melody. it wouldn't be hard because the melody is soft, it's lyrical, it's tonal. Bebop melodies are not like that. Bebop emerged in Harlem, not in Carnegie Hall, but uptown, in clubs like the Three Deuces, the Onyx Club, places which were associated with a specific culture. The bebop culture was one that was characterized by almost a proto-hipster ideology. People who lived in self-imposed poverty, starving artists who rejected the commercial success of jazz, the conformity and the simplicity of the style which had become so commercially successful. They had a relaxed attitude about morality and sex and drugs. Unfortunately, many of them fell victim to drug epidemic, particularly heroin, which was an especially virulent scourge that claimed many lives very early. Not just Charlie Parker, who died of cirrhosis as much as anything else. He was described as having the liver of an 80-year-old man after his autopsy. Parker was 35 when he died. Sonny Stitt, Fats Navarro, other names that come to mind when we talk about the drug epidemic of the bebop culture. When we see the swing era, we think of these sort of polished players, and they're wearing tuxedos or matching dinner jackets, and they're sort of bopping along together, and there's a kind of air of sophistication. Bebop musicians rejected that to some degree. We talked about how they were in some way countercultural in that they rejected the commercial success of jazz. One of the reasons was fiscal. Jazz had become successful, and as we said with the case of Glenn Miller, some people were making a fortune. But it tended to be the case that the people who were making that big money were not necessarily the most virtuosic, were not the most facile on their instruments. Benny Goodman was a great player, superb, and an excellent arranger. Almost nothing you could say that would be critical of many of the figures from this period. But it happened to be the case that they were raking in the lion's share of the money. So these musicians in Harlem are thinking, you know what, let's do something that can't be imitated. And this way it will really be ours. It will belong to us. The style will be inimitable. And therefore, it will be, yes, perhaps a little more esoteric. Yes, perhaps less palatable to the average listener. And bebop remains today, I would suggest, one of the more polarizing styles of jazz. In the same way that Verdi might be analogous to the swing era. Who doesn't love Verdi, right? It's music which is melodic. It's easy to follow along. If you like opera, you're going to like Verdi. Whereas bebop might be akin to someone I mentioned earlier, Wagner. Not everybody's going to like Wagner. But if you really like complexity and sort of abstract plots and philosophical ideas woven into the music, you're going to like Wagner. So it's an acquired taste and not the most palatable one, again, to use that analogy. Bebop has a somewhat chaotic, frenetic quality. Part of that is due to the harmonic rhythm, the rate at which the chords change. So if we were to play bebop, it has a kind of slow tempo, actually. Should really be played much faster, something like. It just becomes incoherent at some point, right? And if you're playing at, let's say, 240 beats per minute, well, that would mean how many beats per second? 4 beats per second. And you could have 2 chords per measure of 4/4, meaning that the chords are changing every half second. And every chord, as we said earlier with our language analogy, might have a very distant relationship to the previous chord. So to be able to play a bebop melody, that's written on the page, you've got to have extreme dexterity, tremendous facility with your instrument. But to improvise in the bebop idiom, you have to be not only facile on your instrument, but you have to have a powerful cerebral understanding of the style. Remember, it was, I don't want to say invented, it was pioneered by musicians like Charlie Parker, like Dizzy Gillespie, Bud Powell, Thelonious Monk, people who were trying to create something which could not be imitated. And for that reason, it remains today a sort of crucible for any jazz musician. If I can add another personal anecdote as a footnote to this story, when I started playing an instrument, my first instrument, may surprise some of you, it was actually saxophone. There's 2 or 3 people in this room right now who knew me as a teenager. And so you'll remember that I played my saxophone, and God bless my parents for their patience in indulging me my long hours of practicing saxophone. I admittedly always had a facility with reading music. I don't know where it comes from. Nobody in my family is a musician. Even in my extended family, there are no musicians. Some great singers, but none who could read music. I always gravitated towards sheet music. And I remember going to my high school jazz director and I said, you know, I'm practicing a lot, what should I play? And he said to me, play Charlie Parker transcriptions. So, okay, Mom, can you take me to the music store? I've got to get these things called transcriptions by a guy named Charlie Carter, I think. So I get the transcriptions and I go home. And it was this moment of, what am I supposed to do with this? If I play it at 60 beats per minute, great. But I've got to play it 4 times as fast if I want to follow the instructions on the page. It was a rude awakening, you might say. I was like a balloon that had been inflated, and all of a sudden, someone had taken a needle to that balloon, and that needle was called Charlie Parker transcriptions. We're going to look at one in a moment, and you're going to see just how intricate and complex the bebop idiom is. Again, this music, because we've set this goal for ourselves to try to be able to orally distinguish, that is, say, use our ears with a blindfold on and say, yes, this is Dixieland, this is swing, this is bebop. We want to get so confident that if this is the double jeopardy, daily double at the bottom of the category, you're going to have ironclad confidence in your response. So, how do we hear bebop? Well, let's take a look at a transcription and see if we can follow along. We start with the head. The head, of course, is the tune. And the tune, this part that's written out is not the improvisation. I'll call out when the improvisation starts. Personally, I think you'll recognize when it starts. One of the ways you'll hear that one part is written out and one part is not is that the part that's written out will be doubled. That is to say, the melody will be shared by a saxophone, and in this case a trumpet, playing simultaneously in parallel. So therefore, it has to be coordinated. It has to be something that's written out in advance. Here is Charlie Parker's Confirmation. Let's consider, by the way, how tightly synchronized that trumpet and saxophone duet is. It's so tight that unless you're listening closely, it might escape you that there are 2 instruments playing the tune. And let me suggest that even reading the written out part, forget the solo, we haven't gotten there yet, is already very demanding. There are accents that are off the beat. There are dissonant notes. There are C flats against a B flat dominant 7th chord. That's not in the chord symbol, but the C flat sort of fits. It's a flat 9, if you will. So there's all sorts of things swirling around here and coalescing in the music, which you can imagine would be very daunting, very intimidating, even to a seasoned jazz performer. Now, as you could probably guess from looking at this section here, the improvisation is about to start. Notice, by the way, how quickly the chords change, and they all have names. F, E, half diminished, A7, D minor 7, G7, C minor 7, F7, B flat 7. E flat with a tritone substitution, no big deal there. You know, 2 chords on opposite ends of the circle of fifths, and yet they're both perfectly viable. there's a reason for that. The chord E flat has the note G in it. The chord A minor 7 has the note G in it. The common tones that bind these, one is the third, one is the seventh, and those are the two most important tones in terms of flavoring a harmony. So the complexity here is profound. This arcane symbol means G half diminished 7, C7, and then we get a loop on the pattern. So here is what bebop improvisation would sound like when played by someone like Charlie Parker. You can see here, by the way, at the top left corner, it says third chorus. These solos, because you have such a small ensemble of, say, 4 or 5 people, you can now stretch out as a jazz musician would play. Each soloist might play in a recording from that period for a full minute, minute and a half, but in a live performance it might go on many minutes. Miles Davis wrote in his autobiography about one of the reasons he dropped out of Juilliard was because he goes uptown and he sees this music being performed and he's captivated by how much variation on a single chord progression these musicians are coming up with. And it should be said, I think it's obvious just by looking at the score, that the dexterity of Charlie Parker was simply unparalleled. We look here. It's one thing to play a stream of notes like this at that tempo on a piano or violin or an instrument that does not require breathing. How does one fit that many notes at that tempo and articulate it cleanly? Well, it tells you a lot about Charlie Parker. This was not just a degenerate drug addict. He was not just some deadbeat who was behind on paying his musicians, which he was, or was duplicitous in his business dealings, which he was. You've all heard the expression, you can't trust a drug addict, and that's true. Nowadays, we treat drug addiction as a disease, and we have clinics and rehabilitation facilities, and we try to help people who suffer from these diseases. Parker was a hopeless heroin addict. It started when he was a teenager. He was gigging in the Midwest, and he was in a van, and the van hydroplaned apparently on an icy road, and he sustained a back injury, went to a hospital. What did they give him? Morphine. And he became addicted to that sensation. When he went out to the West Coast in the late 1940s, they didn't have heroin out there, so he became a really, really profoundly warped alcoholic. And when I say warped, I mean so much so that he was drinking in excess of 1 liter of whiskey a day. He would go into the studio, in fact, there are stories about him falling over in the studio and playing the first 8 bars before literally falling over, or swinging in a rather chaotic fashion off to the side, such that they had to take a cut, take a break, have him sober up before they could come back and complete the recordings. Those recordings, by the way, from the late 40s, somewhat controversial. Parker himself was infuriated that they were released. He felt that it reflected his playing in a very negative way. But some later jazz musicians describe them as being some of the most beautiful things he ever played, that there's a raw vulnerability in his playing. Charles Mingus, about whom we've said a few things already in this lecture series, famously extolled and exalted those recordings of Charlie Parker, clearly inebriated, and yet still somehow facile in an unparalleled way on his alto saxophone. The bebop phenomenon was always a kind of exclusionary one, by design, as we've said. These musicians were trying to forge a style which was inimitable. They were buoyed up by music journalists of that time, writers, people who were going to see this music and said, this is something really special. This is something visionary and unique and novel. A lot of established jazz musicians had a very contrary opinion. Louis Armstrong, about whom we said quite a bit last week, a pioneer in jazz history, someone who had a career that lasted half a century, playing primarily in his familiar Dixieland style, was reported to have described this music as sounding like Chinese music. Well, I can tell you, having lived in Sichuan province for a brief period, it doesn't sound anything like Chinese music, of course. We know that. But what Armstrong was getting at was that it was unintelligible to him. It was incoherent. It lacked any sense of formal organization. And I think having juxtaposed it, it's impossible to mix the two up, wouldn't you say? So we're smarter now than we were 45 minutes ago. Charlie Parker died in 1955, and his legacy is a very rich one. He was known as Yardbird or Bird. There's a number of compositions that are intertwined with his moniker. For example, Bird Gets the Worm, Ornithology, Yardbird Suite. In addition to writing music and playing at blisteringly fast tempos with perfectly articulated 16th note rums like the ones we saw here in this transcription. By the way, chicken and an egg, just to clarify, the recording comes first, and then somebody with really good ears and a lot of time sits down and transcribes. Once again, to bring you into, give you a window into the world of college music theory, one of the especially torturous tasks that music theory students have to endure. Some of them like it, but let me suggest that would be a real oddity if a student like this. It's called dictation. Probably gives some people the willies just thinking about it. Dictation essentially takes place when the instructor sits at the piano, plays something, and then says to the students, "What did I play? Who can write it on the board?" So imagine taking dictation with this. There are not many people who like dictation or music theory in general for them. It's too bad. There are some people who like it. I even have a student this semester who is not registered for music theory. She's not even a music major, and yet she comes and takes ear training classes for fun. I suggest that that student is a very special student for more reasons than one. Yeah, she may be here right now. As with any style of music, there's going to be a backlash to an existing trend. And if bebop had a heyday of, say, 10 years from 1945 to 55, and I think there are many great bebop musicians we could talk about, but Charlie Parker is maybe the ultimate symbol because his death in 1955, much like Glenn Miller's death in 1944, is a sort of symbolic end of an era. Parker, by the way, before he died, made some very interesting recordings, including some with a classical string quartet in the 50s. Beautiful recordings. I encourage you to get out on the Google machine and just look for Charlie Parker with string quartet. He was very interested in classical music. As I intimated earlier, his understanding of music theory was profound. So it's not surprising that he would have been drawn to the music of Igor Stravinsky and Arnold Schoenberg. And in fact, Gunther Schuller, in a famous lecture given at my alma mater at Brandeis University, would coin a term to describe this melding, this fusion of classical elements with traditional jazz. He would call it third stream. And Parker, although he's not often associated with or credited with this particular issue, is really a pioneer of third stream music. We're going to end today's program by talking about the backlash against bebop and the establishment of a new style which is sometimes associated with California and is therefore called West Coast jazz or sometimes cool jazz. Some of the musicians associated with this style would include Miles Davis at this particular point in his career. We're going to talk about him. We're going to talk a lot more about him next week when we talk about modal jazz in the 1960s. Davis went to Juilliard. He was accepted at, I think he was 16 or 17. I think it's not unreasonable to call Davis a prodigy. He had perfect pitch, so the ability to hear any tone or group of tones and to immediately identify those tones, to play anything by ear. It's a great gift, but as I tell my students, It's a party trick. It's a nifty thing to have to impress people when you're hanging out. What tone is this? C. Great. What about this? G. B flat. It's nice. It's not necessary to be a great musician. However, it's certainly advantageous. At Juilliard, Miles Davis shares a story about sitting in a class, music history class of some sort. The professor in 1941 says, "And now, class, we're going to talk about the blues." We're going to talk about the blues next week, by the way, when we look at John Coltrane's Mr. PC. And the professor is doing what professors do, strutting around and pontificating, probably in a somewhat pompous way. This particular professor is never named, but apparently what the pedagogue, quote, said here was, we're going to talk about the blues. Everybody knows that the blues is a genre that's associated with sadness and grief, and black people sing the blues because they're filled with grief and lamentation, and therefore that's what the genre is associated with. Miles Davis raises his hand, and he says, "My daddy's a dentist, and we're rich. And I went horseback riding on weekends, and I had the nicest clothes, and I got a new horn every couple years, and we sang the blues all the time, so what the hell are you talking about?" It's no surprise that Davis lasted less than half a semester at Juilliard. In his 20s, he was clearly enchanted with bebop, and at a young age, he was already on stage playing at those clubs we mentioned, the Three Deuces, the Onyx Club, Minton's Playhouse. He's on stage with people who were his idol when he moved up. Monk, Bird, Diz. Jazz musicians often have very colorful, poetic nicknames. See, she's back just in time for the cool jazz. You skip bebop, probably a good thing. Miles evolved constantly as a musician. So much so that he refused to play even his most popular stuff. His 1959 spring recording of Kinda Blue remains today the best-selling jazz record of all time. It's the one that has that famous introduction. The so what chord, yeah. And he was asked, "Play so what, Miles? Play so what? Please play it. The audience wants to hear it." And he always demurred. He always rejected the request, sometimes with an emphatic no. Miles was a very blunt individual. There would probably be an expletive somewhere in the sentence. Sometimes with a stock response such as, "That piece makes my lips itch." Later on, when he would be dictating his biography, he would emphatically repeat a mantra that a musician has to evolve constantly. So if you look at music from the 1980s when Miles makes his post-cocaine addiction comeback, he's playing what I think many people would consider to be some very weird music. The album Tutu, the album You're Under Arrest, features some very bizarre tracks. He could have made a lot more money playing in a more popular style. But remember, we talked about this bebop mentality, this attitude of rejecting commercialism, living in your own sort of self-imposed cocoon of artistic sovereignty. Well, that certainly was the case. At this point, in the 1950s, he's rejecting bebop and embracing a new style, which would be called cool jazz. A series of recordings made in the early 50s were released in 1957 under the album title Birth of the Cool. I'm going to listen to a track very briefly, and then I'll say a few more words about cool jazz before we move on. Here is Moon Dreams from that album. Makes you want to sink into a warm bath. This is music which is far more palatable, I think, than the frenetic, chaotic style of bebop. I want to mention two nutmeggers who we've talked about a little bit, but who were on the forefront of this movement. And I don't know if it's fair to call them nutmeggers, but both are associated with the great state of Connecticut, so we'll mention them. Darian's own Gerry Mulligan playing baritone saxophone on this album. Remember we said we want to be able to hear a style and say what it is? Let me say this. It would be difficult if you were presented with cool jazz, something from the swing era. It might be difficult to tell the two apart. They both have that sort of warm lyrical tone, a very melodic contour to the tune which is written out. But let me suggest that cool jazz can be distinguished by its timbre or sound color. In cool jazz, you're going to hear, as you hear in this nonet which is playing, unusual sounds of the baritone saxophone, the flugelhorn. You're going to hear brushes on the snare drum. You're going to hear mute in the trumpet, things that you'd be less likely to hear in the 1930s. So it's really a timbral sound. Let me mention one more composer, one more piece before we end tonight's program. In 1959, we're going to pick up in 1959 next week, we have an album by Dave Brubeck, another nutmegger, called Time Out. Music in odd time signatures, 5/4, 7/4. My favorite one is hard to describe. How would we? Well, if you wrote it in 9/8, you'd have to write 2 + 2 + 2 + 3/8 for 3 measures, then 3 + 3 + 3/8. So it could be 1 2 1 2 1 2 1 2 3 1 2 1 2 1 2 1 2 3 1 2 1 2 1 2 1 2 3 1 2 3 1 2 3 1 2 3 1 2 1 2 1 2 1 2. Well, that's one of the more chaotic pieces that Brubeck wrote. What I would suggest that quartet was best known for is maybe the iconic sound of the alto saxophone played by Paul Desmond. Paul Desmond, Stan Getz, these are people who are on the cusp of this new era, and they're pioneering a new sound, one which is based on a smooth, lyrical approach to playing the saxophone, rather than this driving, straight ahead, again, somewhat honking timbre that we encounter in the recordings of Charlie Parker. Two totally different approaches to playing the saxophone. So different, in fact, that they may sound like different instruments. And Paul Desmond's sound is prominent, I think, in the public's ear because many people would immediately recognize. Right, Take 5, which is so iconic, I think, in large part thanks to Paul Desmond's, in that tone that he's channeling on the record. By the way, that tune in 5/4 makes it quite unusual in jazz, in the annals of jazz history. One of my favorite mutations of an existing jazz chart is Tito Puente's version of Take 5, which he, ironically and somewhat paradoxically, puts in 4/4 and turns into a sort of a rumba piece. Very different from Brubeck's incarnation, however, a very fresh take on such a historic piece. We're going to end tonight in 1959, but we're going to pick up next week, and we have 2 important albums from 1959 to discuss. One by Miles Davis, and that's going to be that landmark cornerstone record, Kind of Blue, which opens with So What, And then we're going to talk about the fall of 1959, where John Coltrane goes into the studio and records one of the most difficult pieces in the jazz canon, the aptly named Giant Steps. We'll revisit some familiar faces next week, and we'll encounter some new ones as we plumb the depths of this turning point of 1959 and encounter the modal jazz that came after bebop and cool jazz. Thank you all for coming out tonight.